Hey y'all, welcome back to In the Kitchen with Baker Girl. Thank you, Jesus. It's a lovely day to be in the kitchen. Now, continuing my Let's Chat About series, today we're going to chat about salt. Now, in front of me, I have 3 different varieties of salt. Now, salt at the end of the day is just salt. However, some salts have more flavor than other salts. Some salts are saltier than other salts, and some salts have more minerals than other salts. And when you use these salts and how you use these salts does matter. Now, let's take a common salt that we all are very familiar with. Here to my right, I have good old-fashioned iodine salt, which is what I call fine salt or table salt. Now, this salt does contain iodine. Now, iodine is very important for our overall health. So you need some iodine in your diet. You can get that in the form of different types of greens, such as spinach and kale, which is another good source of iodine. However, if your diet is a little bit low on those things, use some iodine salt. Now, this is the salt that I use for majority of my baking. I don't use it for cooking, but I do use it for baking. Now, because we eat a diet that's rich in greens anyway, or at least I like to think it's rich in greens anyhow, I don't worry about using this every day for health reasons, I mean. But this is the salt that you're going to find most recipes are going to call for, most baking recipes especially, I always refer to it as fine salt or table salt. And this is the salt that I mean in any recipe that I leave in the description for you. If there's a special type of salt that I use, I'll list it in the recipe. Now, salt number 2 that you'll find used mostly in cooking, not a lot in baking, but mostly in cooking, is here, which is kosher salt. Now, this is called kosher salt because it is pure. There's no additives to kosher salt, unlike our iodine salt, which has iodine added. Now, kosher salt is good for just all-around cooking. This is a coarse kosher salt because unlike our fine salt here, which is very, very fine granules, our kosher salt is a little bit coarser, and you can get it fine. You can get it finely ground, or you can get it coarse, or you can get it very coarse. This is just a basic coarse kosher salt. Now, you can use kosher salt for canning because it's pure, so it can also be substituted for canning. Your iodine table salt cannot be used for canning because the iodine additive can actually it can have a unwanted effect on any type of canning or pickling. So if you're canning, be sure to just stick with kosher salt. And I'll talk a little bit more about canning salt in a minute. Now, my absolute favorite salt in the kitchen to use is pink Himalayan salt. Now, this is a salt that has tons of minerals in it. It's very good for you. It has lots of different health properties. I'm actually looking at a bag of it now. It has lots of different health properties. And it does not contain iodine, but it has lots of trace minerals from calcium, iodine, zinc, magnesium, all different types. And the bag says it has 84 minerals, which is really, really good for you. And so it's a salt that it's good for your body overall. So if you can incorporate pink Himalayan salt into your diet, that's good. Now, pink Himalayan salt, unlike kosher salt and iodine salt, if you're using this salt for baking, you don't need to worry about it in cooking. Like if you're seasoning some chicken breasts or maybe some popcorn or, seasoning some beans or pasta or something like that, fish or whatever, there's no need to worry about it. However, for baking, I have learned that the minerals, the trace minerals in pink Himalayan salt can make your breads rise a lot faster, particularly something like brioche. It can make your brioche rise too fast, and it also can cause it to overproof unless you're watching it very closely. So let's take just a basic brioche. Depending on the time that I have or I want to invest into baking a loaf of brioche, I could either use half Himalayan salt and half fine table salt, which is iodine salt, or kosher salt. Now, I would never go over half for this because, like I say, it makes your yeast very excited and your dough rise a lot faster. I save my pink Himalayan salt for sourdough bread. Now, it helps sourdough bread because the minerals helps it to rise better, and you get a better overall bread versus, and I've tested this using kosher salt versus the pink Himalayan salt. And I actually have discovered that I prefer the pink Himalayan salt for my sourdough bread, even though it reacts very differently with brioche, where it rises a lot faster. For some reason with sourdough bread, it doesn't rise faster than a loaf made with the regular salt. But like I say, the loaf of bread, it just really, you get a much better oven spring. And the ear of your loaf, which is when you slash a loaf of sourdough and you get it where it puffs up and then it just literally blows up like that, and you get that beautiful crust on top. It's better with pink Himalayan salt. And I'm not entirely sure why, but that's just what I found in my sourdough baking. So now, when it comes to another type of salt, which is a lot of, some people have a little bit of drawback to, but that is MSG. Now, this is controversial on some levels and for some people. Some people don't want MSG in anything, and that's your choice. It's entirely up to you. I don't have a problem using MSG because MSG, which is monosodium glutamate, is another type of salt. It is just as much as a salt as all of the salts that I have here. It's just salt. Now, I know some people feel like they're allergic to it. And if you are allergic to it, then by all means, don't use it. But it's just salt. And I grew up with the mother in the age where everybody was like, our foods doesn't contain MSG, and I remember I thought MSG was something awful. Mom was like, oh, we can't eat that. It has MSG. And I'm like, oh goodness, put that back on the shelf. And then as I, started cooking and looking into different types of ingredients of foods that I use, I realized it's just salt. So why are we banning this salt? So it's up to you. MSG adds that extra, I'm not quite sure what it is, but I know I tasted flavor in food. And I'm talking about chicken, beans, any type of cooking. It's not useful for baking to me because you don't need that savory profile in baking. But if you're cooking chicken or beans or steak or roast or vegetables, anything like that, MSG is good to add. And I just add some of it. Also, if you use chicken bouillon, it has MSG in it. And that's kind of the secret ingredient of chicken bouillon. So I have no problem using MSG. I keep some in my kitchen. But if you have a problem with it, then, just leave it out. However, if you do leave it out, just know you're missing that extra flavor that your food has. Now, and I do want to get back to my mother's cooking. Even though Mama would not reach for a container of this at the grocery store, put it in the, and buy it and use it, she did use chicken bouillon. And that does contain MSG. And I think the flavor that chicken bouillon gives to your food, which is unmatched, really, to me, just much better than just basic salt, Mama kind of, sacrificed, I'd say, her principles on it in that regard. Or maybe she just used it and didn't really worry about the MSG that was in it. But she always used chicken bouillon. And chicken bouillon has always contained MSG. So, that's that. Now let's talk about the best salts for canning. Now, if you've seen my canning and preserving video, and I'll leave a link to the playlist in the iCards, whenever I'm canning, I always advise you to either use canning salt, which is this beat up, banged up much used box that I have here, or you can use kosher salt. Now, those are the only two salts that I recommend for canning. The reason is the minerals in pink Himalayan salt and the added iodine in iodized salt can have a unwanted effect on your canned products. Your pickles, it's best to just stay away from these two salts when it comes to canning, because they don't work well, and it actually can mess up your canning, your finished products. And when you go through all that work, whether it's picking, and snapping green beans, or, going through all this work to pickle eggs, and only to discover that somewhere along the line, your finished product doesn't quite turn out the way you want it to be, and your salt could be to blame. So even though salt is an important ingredient in canning, you don't want your salt to derail all your hard work. So stick with the canning salt or kosher salt. Now, canning salt, just like kosher salt, is pure salt. So it's a much finer ground salt than your kosher salt, coarse kosher salt. So you can use this just like you would kosher salt for canning. You can also use this in just regular cooking too. You don't have to save this for canning. It says canning salt, but it's not for just canning. You can use it and put it in some beans or some chicken, and you never even notice. It's just salt. But it's finely ground, so it dissolves nice and easily in, whatever you're canning. And especially if you say you're salting cucumbers, or you're salting, something for relish or whatever, you need a fine salt so that you don't have these lumps of salt sitting in places. So you want to make sure everything is well coated. Especially if you're making something like sauerkraut or anything fermented, you want to make sure that your salt is evenly distributed. You don't have clumps of salt sitting all over the place. So that's the reason why you use canning salt for canning. Now, another salt I want to talk about, well, two other salts, is sea salt and rock salt. Now, sea salt is just that. It's a salt that has a high... it has more of a salty flavor than, say, your regular iodine salt. And it's another pure salt, but has trace minerals. Now, pink Himalayan salt has trace minerals because it comes from the Himalayan mountain region. The sea salt comes from, say, you can get it from the Dead Sea in Israel, or you can also get various types of sea salts from the coastal areas of Japan. So it's just that it's salt that comes from the sea, and it can be you can get really artisanal with some of those salts, such as, like the fancy finishing salts that you see in the grocery store that are very expensive. Those salts are literally just a finishing salt. You wouldn't cook with those salts. Number one, they're too expensive. Number two, they're not really for that type. They're not for that use. So, like you have a flaky sea salt you would sprinkle over if you have like a salted caramel chocolate tart, and you finish it off with a little bit of flaked sea salt. Those salts are usually reserved for those types of things. And rock salt is what you use if you're making ice cream. Now, I've made ice cream before, and I had rock salt. Unfortunately, I've ran out. Plus, it's fall now, so kind of ice cream season is over with in my area. But rock salt, which is very large clumps of salt, is useful because it helps your ice cream to freeze. And the salt lowers the temperature and helps the ice cream to freeze, so therefore it can churn if you're using an old-fashioned churner. Now, if you're using, a new type of ice cream maker, you wouldn't have to worry about rock salt. But my ice cream maker is a perfectly old antique ice cream maker where you have to pack the ice in and pack the salt in, then put your thing in there and pour the ice cream base and let it churn. It makes a ton of noise. And for that, you do need rock salt. So if you make a lot of ice creams, you might want to consider keeping some rock salt in your pantry. Now, let's chat about the saltiness levels of salt, because salts do have a saltiness level. Now, there are certain types of salt and certain brands of salt that are more salty than others. Now, the ones that I have here in front of me, from your iodine table salt will be the most saltiest of your salts that you have, usually just for everyday use. And the pink Himalayan salt comes in at a close second to iodine salt. The least saltiest of the salts that I have in front of me is kosher salt. Now, and why that is, salt experts can explain it. All I know is that it is kosher salt is the least saltiest of your salts. Now, when you are baking, you do want to weigh salt, because as much as I love using, like just a teaspoon of this or a teaspoon of that, when you're baking, you want to be a bit more precise, because all of these salts weigh differently and the saltiness level is different. So for instance, a teaspoon of iodine salt is 6 grams. A teaspoon of kosher salt is 4 to 5 grams. And a teaspoon of pink Himalayan salt is around 5 to almost 6 grams. Now, that sounds like just absolute, somebody's nitpicking over numbers. Now, let's just say you're a professional baker and you bake, large quantities of bread. Now, you may use for each loaf, and I'm just throwing out a few figures here. Let's just say you use a teaspoon of salt for each loaf of bread and you want to bake 30 loaves of bread, or you want to bake 100 loaves of bread, however many loaves of bread that you would be baking. You weigh that because you can just say, okay, I know I'm making 30 loaves of bread and I need, this amount of salt, and I have it weighed out, and I can weigh it out and add it right to it. Now, if you said, well, 4 grams of salt for kosher salt versus 6 grams of salt for iodine salt, you think that don't matter? Well, you've got 2 extra grams of salt. And if you're making 100 loaves of bread, you've got 2 extra grams times. And then you're like, oh no, how do I end up with 50 extra grams of salt? Well, those 2 extra grams add up. And I'm just throwing out some numbers, but that's why you may not think 4 grams versus 6 grams, that's nitpicking. It actually isn't. So as a baker myself, and I do bake by weight, not by volume, that extra 2 or less of the 2 grams of salt does make a difference. And in baking, especially if you're baking with yeast or sourdough, salt plays a very important part. If you do not bake with salt, your baked goods will not turn out right. So I'm talking about even something as innocent as a pie crust needs salt, because salt is flavor. And I hear people from time that goes, oh, I don't use any salt. I don't even touch it. I don't even have it in my house. And I'm thinking, so how do you taste your food? Because the best way I like to think about salt is like a light. For instance, you can have a room full of all kinds of beautiful treasures, but if you don't turn a light on in that room, you'll never know the stuff is in there. But when you turn the light on, you're like, oh, I've got chandeliers, I've got this, I've got that, I've got beautiful rugs, I've got Persian carpets. But in the dark, you never know any of that stuff is there. So when you're cooking, you could be using all kinds of herbs and spices and, this and this. But salt brings out the flavors that are in those things. Otherwise, they just don't have the same level of flavor on their own. That is why you need salt in cooking or baking. Also, salt is a necessary mineral for people. You need, really for any living thing, you need salt. If you watch some animal shows, you'll see how a lot of animals will go to great lengths to get their hands on some salt, especially where we live here in the mountains. Some people put out a salt lick for deers, and those deers will come from all around and they will gather around that block of salt, just licking away, because they need salt in their diet just like we do. Salt deficiency can have a bad effect on your system, so you need some salt. And to get back to the point of baking with salt, yeast needs some salt in order to work properly for your baked goods. Now, I have baked bread and I have forgot to add the salt. And I wondered why it just wasn't baking good. It wasn't browning good. It just looked like some sort of sad, miserable little loaf. And then I cut into it and took a bite and I'm like, oh, this doesn't taste good. And then I'm like, oh, I forgot to put the salt. So you may not think a teaspoon or, half a teaspoon of salt makes that much difference. But when you're baking with yeast bread, if you forget the salt, it can derail the whole loaf and it won't taste like anything. So even in buttercreams, you need a little pinch of salt to help bring out all those good flavors. Too much salt obviously is not what you want in any form of cooking and anywhere in your kitchen. You don't want to go overboard with salt because we still have to consider sodium levels. It is good in our bodies. But to say no salt is not, in our house, we use salt. We don't overuse salt. We don't, I'm not a salt loving person, but I do not like foods without any salt on them because it just doesn't have the same flavor. Now, for just general everyday cooking, typically, and I know people, be concerned about how much salt their intake and all, but if you bake from scratch at home and you're seasoning your own food, you can control how much salt you add to your own food versus, if you're buying something that's already packaged. Well, the salt that's in there is, you're pretty much stuck and you have to, unless, you consume less of it. But at home, we normally don't use half the amount of salt that commercially processed foods contain. So in this little episode, you see the different types of salts and the importance of salts. And there are many other different types of salts that I didn't discuss today. But, get some small amounts of them and then just cook with them and try them out and see, which salt works best for you. You may find that you're perfectly content with just using a regular table iodine salt. You don't want to worry, you don't want to use Himalayan salt or kosher salt or whatever. That's perfectly fine. You can work out very well with this salt for just general everyday baking and cooking. But if you want to take your cooking to another little level and add in, it's always good to sneak in a little extra health benefits in our food. And that's where salts with these trace minerals like pink Himalayan salt comes in. So I hope you have found this series in our Let's Chat About series helpful and useful to you. If you have enjoyed these episodes, please give us a thumbs up. If you haven't already subscribed, like and subscribe. And if this is the first episode that you're seeing, be sure to check out my Let's Chat About series. And therefore you'll see all of the videos that I've uploaded where we're chatting about different ingredients that we use in our kitchen, how to use them and what's the best way to use them for, and also how to use these ingredients wisely, because some things cost us a little more than other things. Some things we can get a bargain on and save money, and then some things we have to kind of, go ahead and get the good stuff sometimes. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Give us a thumbs up, and the good Lord willing, stay tuned because there will be more episodes coming in my Let's Chat About series. Until next time, I'll chat with you guys later. Take care, y'all. Bye.